Rain poured down like a waterfall at 2 a.m. on that fateful Tuesday. Droplets slammed against the awning of the Obsidian nightclub like rapid gunfire, tearing through the quiet skin of the sleeping city. Alara Reyes pushed open the heavy back door and stepped outside, her narrow shoulders trembling under the knife-sharp cold wind. She had just finished an 8-hour cleaning shift, her hands numb from chemical disinfectant, her knees aching from hours spent kneeling on hard floors. But she had no right to complain. This was her second job of the day. That morning she had worked at a cafe starting at 5:30, and when she got home she still had to finish piles of laundry she washed for other people, stacked high in the corner of the room. 36 hours without sleep. But Sophie's hospital bills didn't pay themselves. Alara pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body and hurried toward her battered old car parked at the farthest corner of the lot. A 1998 Honda Civic with peeling paint, a right window held together with tape, an engine that wheezed like an old man coughing every time it started. But it was her most valuable possession, the only thing that carried her between 3 jobs every single day. She had just slid into the driver's seat and wiped rain from her face when her phone vibrated. A message from St. Mary Hospital. Her heart seemed to stop as she read the words glowing on the screen. Sophie Reyes requires urgent dialysis. Please settle this month's bill before the 15th. The current balance is $8,200. Failure to pay will result in suspension of treatment. Alara stared at the screen as the letters blurred before her eyes. $8,200. She had $127 in her account. $127 to cover rent, food, bus fare on the days her car broke down, and now $8,200 in hospital bills. Her shoulders began to shake. Then her whole body followed. She collapsed forward onto the steering wheel and sobbed. Her crying was swallowed by the roar of rain outside. No one heard, no one saw. She was utterly alone in her broken-down car, in the empty parking lot of a glamorous nightclub she would never be worthy of entering through the front door. Sophie was only 19. Her little sister was only 19 and slowly dying from a brutal kidney disease. A disease that had stolen her youth, stolen her college dreams, stolen everything a 19-year-old girl deserved to have. And now it was about to steal her life simply because her sister was too poor, too powerless, too useless. Alara slammed her fist against the steering wheel and screamed in despair. Why? Why was life so cruel? She had worked like a slave, sacrificed everything, given up every dream of her own, and it still wasn't enough. It was never enough. After 10 minutes of crying with her head down, Alara forced herself to steady her breathing. She wiped her tears with her sleeve, drew a deep breath, and started the engine. She had to go home. She had to see Sophie. She had to hold her sister and tell her everything would be all right, even though she had no idea how she would ever keep that promise. The rain continued to fall as if it wanted to drown the entire world. The windshield was a blur despite the wipers working at full speed. Alara glanced into the rearview mirror and tried to back out of the space. Tears still clouded her vision. Her mind was still spinning around the number $8,200. She didn't see the car behind her. She didn't see the silhouette of the glossy black Rolls-Royce Phantom parked in the VIP corner, the place no cleaning staff ever dared approach. The sound of metal colliding cut through the rain, a sharp, piercing noise that ripped open the night and stabbed straight into Alara's heart. She slammed on the brakes. Her body froze. No, no, no. She slowly turned her head and saw the long, jagged scratch carved into the side of the Rolls-Royce Phantom. The car that even in her panic she knew was worth more than she would earn in her entire lifetime. Her stomach dropped to her feet. Her breath stopped completely. And in that moment, she knew her life had just collapsed entirely. Alara sat there in the car, her entire body numb as if struck by lightning. The rain was still screaming outside, but she couldn't hear it anymore. There was only the sound of her heart pounding violently in her chest, each beat like a hammer crashing into her skull. She slowly opened the car door and stepped out, letting the rain soak her completely, and walked over to look at the damage she had caused. The scratch stretched nearly half a meter long, deep and brutal, tearing through the flawless black paint like claws ripping into flesh. Alara lifted a trembling hand and touched the mark, and it felt as though her own heart was bleeding beneath her fingers. She looked around. The parking lot was deserted. This VIP corner was hidden behind a wall, completely separated from the main area of the club. There were no cameras pointed this way because VIP guests didn't want to be recorded. There were no witnesses because no one stood outside in a storm at 2 a.m. The rain would wash away every tire mark within minutes. She could get back into her car right now. She could drive away. She could disappear into the night, and no one, absolutely no one, would ever know she was responsible. This car was probably worth $500,000. She would never be able to pay for it, even if she worked her entire life. If the owner found her, she'd lose her job. She'd be buried in debt. She'd have no money left to pay for Sophie's treatment. Her sister would die because she chose to be honest. Ilara's fingers rested on the car door handle. All she had to do was pull it open, sit down, start the engine, and leave. No one would know. No one would judge her. No one would force her to take responsibility for this mistake. But at that exact moment, her grandmother's voice rose inside her head. Her grandmother had died 5 years earlier, just before Sophie fell ill, just before Ilara's life turned into a living hell. Yet the lesson remained etched into her soul. Kindness isn't about who's watching, my dear. It's about who you choose to be in the dark, when no one knows what you decided. Her grandmother had raised the 2 sisters after their mother left and their father drank himself to death. She had taught Ilara that the poor might lose everything, but they must never lose their integrity. She had taught her that a clean conscience was the most valuable possession no one could ever steal. Ilara let go of the door handle. Tears mixed with rain streamed down her face. She knew she'd regret this decision. She knew it might cost her everything, but she couldn't look Sophie in the eyes and tell her everything would be all right while living like a coward who ran from her own responsibility. She returned to her car, rummaged through the compartment, and found a small notebook. The notebook where she tracked the money she earned each day, calculating every dollar to see if it would carry her through the week. She tore out a page, found a pen, and began to write. Her hands shook violently. Tears fell and blurred the ink, but she forced herself to write clearly. I accidentally scratched your car. I don't have much money, but I'll take full responsibility. I'm sorry. Ilara Reyes, cleaning staff, night shift. She folded the paper carefully, walked over to the Rolls-Royce, and tucked it beneath the front windshield wiper. She stood there for one more second, watching the small piece of paper flutter in the rain-soaked wind, and felt as though she had just signed her own death sentence. Then she turned and walked away, her narrow shoulders hunched under the weight of the entire world, convinced that the principle her grandmother taught her had just cost her everything she had ever fought to protect. Inside the Obsidian nightclub, on the highest floor where neon lights never reached, Kieran Thornton had just finished a meeting that lasted 5 hours with the leaders of his empire. The meeting had been so tense that the air in the room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. A shipment intercepted at the port. A traitor who needed to be dealt with. A rival pushing into his territory. Familiar problems in a world he ruled with an iron fist and a frozen heart. He was 36 years old, yet his cold gray eyes carried the weight of decades far beyond his age. People called him the Ghost because no one had ever seen him show emotion. Not joy, not sorrow, not fear, not weakness. He was a shadow of himself, a perfect machine designed only to survive and dominate the brutal underworld. Kieran stepped out onto the rear balcony overlooking the VIP parking lot to breathe in the cold air and escape the stench of cigars and the pressure of the meeting room. The rain was still falling, lighter now than before. He stood there, letting the droplets hit his face, and that was when he saw it. A white piece of paper fluttering beneath the windshield wiper of a Rolls-Royce Phantom. His car. Kieran frowned. No one was allowed near his car. No one dared go near his car. He moved quickly down the stairs, straight into the parking lot, and as he drew closer, he saw the scratch. A long, jagged mark along the side of the vehicle like an open wound. Anyone else in his position would have exploded with rage, would have summoned people to comb through surveillance footage, would have ordered a hunt for the person who dared damage the property of the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast. But Kieran didn't do that. He stood still in the rain, staring at the paper, then slowly reached out and pulled it from beneath the wiper. He unfolded it and read, I accidentally scratched your car. I don't have much money, but I'll take full responsibility. I'm sorry. Ilara Reyes, cleaning staff, night shift. Kieran read it once, then he read it again. Rain blurred the ink on the paper, yet he stood there, reading the trembling handwritten lines over and over. And for the first time in 21 years, since the night he held his mother's lifeless body in his arms and swore he'd never let anyone touch his heart again, something cracked inside Kieran's chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was a feeling he believed had died long ago, buried alongside his beloved mother, beneath cold earth. Hope. The raw and vulnerable honesty in those words was something exceedingly rare in his world. A world where everyone lied, everyone betrayed, everyone carried hidden motives behind every word, every gesture, every smile. Yet this girl, this nameless cleaning worker, had scratched a Mafia boss's car, and instead of running, she left her real name, her real position, and a sincere apology. In the dark, when no one was watching, when no one knew, Kieran carefully folded the paper, as if handling a priceless treasure, and slipped it into the inside pocket on the left side of his jacket, right beside his frozen heart. He remained in the rain for a moment longer, staring at the scratch on the car, and the first smile he'd worn in years touched his lips. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, but a smile nonetheless. He needed to know who this girl was. Ilara Reyes. He needed to know why she chose honesty when deception would have been so much easier. He needed to know whether she was truly what those words suggested, or merely a clever illusion he hadn't yet seen through. Kieran turned and walked back inside, the paper warm against his chest. But in an empire built on blood and betrayal, where wolves circled endlessly waiting to tear apart the weak, would Ilara Reyes live long enough for him to find the answer? Or would his enemies discover her first and turn her into their next prey? Ilara reached the apartment when it was nearly 4 a.m. She called it an apartment, but in truth it was nothing more than a tiny room inside the most run-down housing block in the southern part of the city. A place even the police hesitated to enter after sunset. The stairwell reeked of urine and rotting trash. The walls peeled in large sheets, exposing crumbling brick beneath. The hallway lights flickered as if they might die at any moment, and no one bothered to fix them because the landlord had abandoned the building years ago. Ilara stepped inside, trying to open the door as quietly as possible so she wouldn't wake Sophie, but her sister was already awake. Sophie sat on the single battered bed in the room, a thin blanket wrapped around her narrow shoulders, her large eyes fixed on her sister with worry. The room was barely 15 square meters, holding one bed, a miniature gas stove, a rusted sink, and a cramped corner Ilara used to stack the laundry she washed for others. The walls were so damp that mold bloomed in clusters during the rainy season. The only window was jammed shut and had to be covered with tape, and bedbugs. Bedbugs everywhere, no matter how hard Ilara tried to clean. "You're home," Sophie said softly, her voice weak but still forcing a smile. "I couldn't sleep. I was waiting for you." Ilara took off her soaked jacket and hung it on the hook behind the door, then sat down beside her sister. Under the dim yellow light, she could clearly see Sophie's pale skin, her cracked lips, and the bruises left by dialysis needles along her arm. 19 years old. Her sister was only 19 but looked like an old woman slowly withering away. "Why are you so wet? Did something happen?" Sophie asked, lifting a hand to touch her sister's damp hair. Ilara swallowed hard. She wanted to tell Sophie everything. About the scratch, about the $500,000 car, about the note and the decision that might destroy her life. But she couldn't. Sophie had already endured too much. She didn't need one more worry. "It's just the rain," Ilara said, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Have you eaten anything?" "I did. I reheated the porridge you made this afternoon." Sophie nodded, then suddenly took Ilara's hand and squeezed it. "Sister, do you know, today I dreamed about Grandma." Ilara froze. "What did she say?" "She said she was very proud of you." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining even as her body weakened. "She said you're the strongest person she's ever known, and she said everything will be all right." Ilara couldn't hold back her tears. She wrapped her arms around her sister, letting the tears soak into the thin fabric on Sophie's shoulder. She had tried to be strong for so many years. She had swallowed her tears and worked without rest. But tonight, after everything that had happened, she only wanted to cry in the arms of the only family she had left. "I'll save you," Ilara whispered, her voice breaking. "I promise. No matter what happens, I'll find a way to save you." "I know," Sophie said, gently patting her sister's back as if she were the older one. "But you have to take care of yourself too. You're working too much. I can see you getting thinner every day. If you get sick, who'll take care of me then?" Ilara didn't answer. She knew Sophie was right, but she had no other choice. $127, $8,200 in hospital debt, and now a scratch on a $500,000 car belonging to someone who could cost her her job, bury her in debt for life, or something even worse. "Sister, no matter what happens, remember what Grandma taught us," Sophie suddenly said, her voice as light as breath. "A clean conscience is the most valuable possession there is. Never lose it for anything." Ilara nodded and held her sister tighter. Sophie didn't know that she had done exactly that just a few hours earlier, and Ilara didn't know whether that decision would save them both or destroy them. The next morning, Ilara slept for only 1 hour before the alarm rang at 5. She pulled her exhausted body off the thin mattress on the floor where she slept, so Sophie could have the bed, and prepared for her morning shift at the cafe. During the walk there, because she didn't dare drive after the night before, Alara felt as if she were walking on a tightrope. Every step felt heavy. Every car horn made her flinch. She waited for the worst. She waited for someone to appear and say they knew what she had done. She waited for the police. She waited for the car's owner. She waited for judgment. But the morning passed in silence. The afternoon did too. No one came looking for her. No one mentioned the scratch or the car or the note. And that silence was more terrifying than the storm itself. Because Alara knew that in this world, silence was often the warning sign of a storm about to break. While Alara trembled behind the cafe counter on the south side of the city, waiting for a sentence she couldn't see coming, Kieran Thornton was sitting in his private office on the highest floor of Thornton Tower, the skyscraper he owned in the very heart of the financial district. The office was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. But Kieran wasn't looking outside. His cold gray eyes were locked on the computer screen, where security footage from the night before played on a loop. The angle was imperfect because the VIP area deliberately limited cameras, but it was clear enough for him to see the small figure of a young woman stepping out of a battered old car. He saw her standing in the rain, staring at the scratch. He saw her return to her car, take out paper, write something. He saw her shoulders trembling as she placed the note on his car, and he saw her walk away, her back bent, as if she were carrying the weight of the entire world. Kieran rewound the footage and watched it again. Then again. He couldn't stop watching the moment when that girl stood beside his car, clearly battling with herself. She could have left. He knew she understood that. No clear camera angles, no witnesses. The rain would erase every trace. But she didn't leave. She chose to stay and take responsibility. A knock sounded at the door, and Maxwell Briggs stepped inside. Max was Kieran's right hand, head of security, and the man he trusted most in this empire. 32 years old, built like a bear, and absolutely loyal. Max had followed Kieran since they were street kids, and he was one of the very few who knew that the ghost had once possessed a heart. "You called for me, boss?" Max stood straight in front of the desk. Kieran didn't turn, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "Alara Reyes, night shift cleaning staff at Obsidian. Get me everything on her." Max frowned. "Cleaning staff? What happened?" "She scratched my car." Max stiffened. "A cleaning worker dared touch the boss's car? She's as good as dead." "No." Kieran turned around, his gray eyes sharp but carrying something Max had never seen before. "She left a note admitting fault. I want to know who she is. Family, work, finances, everything. Bring it to me within 24 hours. Max studied Kieran for a second, trying to understand why the boss cared about a nameless girl like this. But he knew better than to ask. He nodded and walked out. Neither of them knew that, just outside the door, Miranda Ashford was standing there. She had heard everything. Miranda was the manager of the Obsidian nightclub, 30 years old, beautiful in a sharp and calculated way. Her long black hair was always perfectly styled, her lips red as blood, and her brown eyes knew exactly how to make men kneel. But there was one man who had never knelt before her, and that man was Kieran Thornton. She had loved him for 4 years, loved him obsessively, loved him enough to do anything just to be seen by him. 2 years earlier, she had gotten him, or at least she thought she had. 3 months as the lover of the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast. 3 months in his arms every night, believing she had finally melted that frozen heart. Then one morning, Kieran looked at her with the same cold eyes and said it was over. No explanation, no emotion, just one word, and he turned his back as if those 3 months had never existed. "I don't feel anything." That was all he said when she cried and begged for an explanation. "I'm not capable of loving anyone. You should stop while you still can." Miranda didn't stop. She stayed, worked harder, climbed into the manager position, waiting for the day Kieran would realize she was the only woman suited for him. 4 years of waiting. 4 years of hope. 4 years of watching him treat everyone with the same cold indifference and comforting herself with the thought that at least he didn't love anyone else. And now he was asking about a nameless cleaning girl. He was ordering an investigation into a woman Miranda couldn't even be bothered to remember the face of. Alara Reyes. Miranda clenched her teeth, her brown eyes igniting with a blaze of unhinged jealousy. She didn't know who that girl was, but she knew one thing for certain. Anyone who managed to capture Kieran Thornton's attention was a threat that had to be eliminated, and Miranda Ashford would never allow anyone to take what she believed belonged to her. That evening, When Alara returned to the Obsidian nightclub to begin her cleaning shift, she didn't know that someone was quietly watching her. Agnes Monroe, 65 years old, silver hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, deep brown eyes holding 35 years of memories inside the Thornton estate. She was the family housekeeper, the woman who had cared for Kieran since he was a 5-year-old child toddling after his mother through endless hallways. She had watched that innocent boy turn into a cold and distant boss after his mother's death. And she was the only woman in the world who still held Kieran Thornton's respect. Agnes occasionally visited Kieran's businesses, not out of duty but out of habit, because she had come to see this empire as her own family. Tonight she came to Obsidian, and immediately her gaze was drawn to a small young woman kneeling on the floor in the farthest corner of the club. Alara looked like a ghost. Her skin was so pale it was almost translucent under the dim lights. Dark circles framed her eyes from lack of sleep. Her thin hands moved slowly, as if every motion drained the last bit of strength from her body. She worked alone while the other staff gathered on the opposite side, whispering and glancing at her with open disdain. Agnes frowned. She had spent enough years in this world to recognize isolation when she saw it. She walked slowly toward Alara, her low-heeled shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. Alara heard the footsteps and looked up, fear instantly flooding her eyes. She recognized Agnes. Everyone who worked here knew she belonged to the main estate, the person closest to the boss. If she had come for Alara, it had to be about the scratch. It had to be judgment. "You don't need to look at me like I'm about to eat you," Agnes said, her voice warm and steady like an autumn afternoon. "I just wanted to check on you." "You don't look well." Alara blinked, unsure how to respond. She had braced herself for anger, for accusations, for punishment. This gentle concern caught her completely off guard. "I'm fine," Alara replied hoarsely, "just a little tired." Agnes studied her for a moment, then calmly sat down on a nearby chair, ignoring the fact that it was meant for VIP guests, not for her. She gestured for Alara to sit beside her. "Come sit for a moment. The floor isn't going anywhere." Alara hesitated, but her aching legs carried her down on their own. She sat stiffly, keeping her distance, back straight, hands resting on her thighs like a well-behaved student before a teacher. "How long have you worked here?" Agnes asked. 8 months, ma'am. "And do you work anywhere else?" Alara hesitated. She didn't understand why this woman cared, but something in those warm brown eyes made lying impossible. "I work at a cafe in the mornings and do laundry at night. 3 jobs. Agnes nodded slowly, without surprise or judgment. "You're worried about someone, aren't you?" The simple question pierced the wall Alara had built over so many years. Maybe because Agnes was a stranger. Maybe because Alara was exhausted from carrying everything alone. Maybe because this was the first time in a long while someone had asked her with genuine concern instead of courtesy or curiosity. "My sister," Alara said, her voice trembling. "She has kidney failure. I'm trying to earn money for her hospital bills." Agnes stayed silent, but her wrinkled hand reached out and rested over Alara's. A small gesture that carried more understanding than words ever could. "You're a good sister," she said softly, "and you're doing very well." Alara lowered her head as tears began to fall despite her efforts to stop them. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of this woman. But the tears came anyway, defying her will. Agnes watched the young woman cry in silence, and her heart ached. She saw someone else in Alara, Thomas, her son. 18 years earlier, Thomas had been 27 when he was killed in a gang execution. He had eyes just like these. The eyes of someone who carried too much without ever complaining. The eyes of someone who sacrificed everything for the people they loved. Thomas had died trying to protect a friend, and Kieran, only 18 at the time, had avenged him. That was the beginning of the blood-soaked path the boy would walk for years to come. Agnes had lost her son to this world, but looking at Alara, she felt as if Thomas were standing there again, reminding her that there were still good people who needed protection. "Child," Agnes squeezed Alara's hand gently, "if you ever need anything, come find me. I can't promise I'll be able to help much, but I will listen." Sometimes being heard is enough to survive. Alara looked up at her, eyes red and swollen, and for the first time in many years, she felt that she wasn't completely alone anymore. 3 days had passed since that fateful night, and Miranda Ashford hadn't wasted a single second. She spent all 3 days gathering information, laying plans, and planting poisonous seeds inside the minds of everyone at the Obsidian nightclub. Miranda knew how to manipulate people. She had climbed from a waitress to a manager in just 2 years, not because of competence, but because she knew exactly what to say to the right person at the right moment. And now she would use that very skill to destroy Ilara Reyes. The rumors began in the staff locker room. Miranda whispered to a waitress that she had accidentally overheard the boss investigating the new cleaning girl. Why would a mafia boss care about a nameless employee? There had to be something suspicious. Then Miranda let slip to a security guard that she had heard Ilara deliberately scratch the boss's car to get attention. An old seduction trick that poor girls often use to climb by looks instead of ability. Those tiny fragments quickly fused into a complete picture in everyone's mind. Ilara Reyes, the quiet cleaning girl who moved like a shadow, was actually a cunning fox trying to seduce the boss. She pretended to be innocent, pretended to be pitiful, but in truth she was calculating her escape from poverty. Disgusting, revolting. On the 4th night, when Ilara walked into the club to begin her shift, she felt the change instantly. The eyes that once passed over her as if she were invisible now fixed on her openly with contempt. The whispers she used to half hear became so clear she couldn't pretend anymore. Look at her. She's got some nerve showing up. I heard she rammed the boss's car on purpose just to get noticed. That type will do anything to crawl out of the slums. Disgusting. Looks innocent, but turns out she's calculating. Ilara lowered her head and hurried toward the locker room corner to grab her supplies. Her hands shook. Her heart pounded wildly. She wanted to turn around, to scream that it was all lies, that she hadn't planned anything, that she left that note because of conscience and not to seduce anyone, but her voice died in her throat. She had never been good at defending herself. As a child, whenever her father shouted or beat her, she stayed silent and endured. When her mother left, she didn't cry or accuse anyone. She just held Sophie and told herself she had to be strong. Silence had become her instinct for survival in a world where no one stood on her side. But silence didn't mean it didn't hurt. All night long, Ilara worked alone in the darkest corner of the club. No one spoke to her. No one helped when the trash bins were too heavy. No one shared shifts with her like before. She was completely isolated, as if she carried a contagious disease, and the poisonous whispers followed her everywhere. When she mopped near the bar, 2 waitresses spoke loudly enough for her to hear. I heard she's from the South Side slums, probably been selling herself for years. Now she wants to switch targets to the boss. Ilara bit her lip until it bled. She kept mopping, pretending she hadn't heard, but every word stabbed into her heart like a knife. She hadn't sold herself. She had never touched a man in her life, because she didn't have time for that. Every ounce of her time and strength went to Sophie, to earning money, to surviving one day at a time, but no one cared about the truth. No one wanted to hear her explanation. In their eyes, she was already convicted before any trial. When the shift ended at 3 a.m, Ilara walked out of the club with legs that felt weighted with lead. She walked home through the cold night because she didn't dare drive past the VIP area where the Rolls-Royce might still be parked. During the 40-minute walk, she didn't cry. She wouldn't allow herself to cry on the street where anyone could see her weakness. But when she opened the apartment door, when she saw Sophie sleeping on the bed with shallow breaths, when she was finally somewhere no one could see her, Ilara collapsed onto the floor and broke down. She cried without sound so she wouldn't wake her sister. She clenched her fist to swallow her sobs. Tears soaked the cold floor, but she didn't bother wiping them away. She had done the right thing. She knew she had done the right thing, so why did doing the right thing hurt this much? Why did honesty have to be paid for with humiliation? Why couldn't she live in peace for even a single day? Ilara pressed her head to her knees and cried until she was exhausted, until her body went numb and her mind emptied, until sleep finally came and carried her away from this brutal reality, even if only for a little while. 2 days after the night, Ilara cried herself into exhaustion on the cold floor. The thing she feared most finally happened. She was in the middle of her shift at the cafe when her phone vibrated with a call from St. Mary Hospital. Her heart seemed to stop when she heard the nurse's voice on the other end saying that Sophie Reyes had just been rushed into the emergency room in critical condition. Ilara dropped the tray of coffee she was holding. She didn't ask permission from the manager, didn't untie her apron, didn't stop to think about being fired. She just ran. Ran out of the cafe, ran through crowded streets, ran until her lungs burned and her legs nearly gave out. The hospital was a 20-minute walk away, but Ilara reached it in less than 10. She burst through the emergency room doors, her eyes searching desperately for her sister, and when she saw Sophie lying motionless on the bed with tubes and wires everywhere, she nearly collapsed. Her sister was pale like a sheet of white paper. Her lips were drained of all color. Her eyes were shut tight, her chest rising and falling weakly with the rhythm of a breathing machine. The 19-year-old girl looked like a porcelain doll on the verge of shattering. Alara rushed to the bedside, grabbed her sister's icy hand, and broke down crying. She called Sophie's name, begged her to open her eyes, but Sophie didn't respond. A middle-aged doctor stepped toward her, his expression so grave that Alara knew instantly the news wouldn't be good. "Are you a family member of Sophie Reyes?" the doctor asked. "I'm her sister," Alara replied, her voice shaking. "How is she, doctor? Please tell me." The doctor sighed, glanced down at the medical chart in his hands, then looked back at Alara with deep regret. "Her condition is far worse than we anticipated. Her kidneys have nearly failed completely. Dialysis is no longer enough to sustain her life. She needs a kidney transplant within 6 months, otherwise we can't guarantee anything." Alara felt as if someone had punched her in the chest. A transplant, 6 months. Numbers spun through her mind like a violent storm. "How much will it cost?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer would be unimaginable. The doctor hesitated for a moment before responding. "Including surgery, anti-rejection medication, and post-operative care, the estimated cost is around $250,000. And that's assuming we find a compatible donor in time. $250,000. Alara stood there, unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to do anything except stare at the doctor as if he had just pronounced a death sentence for her sister. $127 in her account, $8,200 in existing hospital debt, and now $250,000. She would have to work more than 20 years without eating or sleeping to earn that amount, but Sophie only had 6 months. After the doctor left, Alara collapsed into the chair beside the hospital bed and cried. She cried without restraint, without hiding, without caring who saw her. She cried from helplessness. She cried from despair. She cried because life had taken everything from her, and now was demanding the last thing she still cherished. "Sister." Sophie's weak voice sounded. "Don't cry." Alara lifted her head and saw that her sister had opened her eyes. Those large eyes were now sunken and exhausted, but still carried the gentleness she always gave her sister. "Sophie." Alara squeezed her hand tightly, tears still falling. "Are you okay? Are you in pain?" "I'm okay." Sophie tried to smile. Though it was so faint it was barely visible. "I heard what the doctor said." "Sister, I want to tell you something." Alara shook her head. "Don't say anything. Just rest. I'll handle everything." "No, listen to me." Sophie squeezed her sister's hand, her eyes shimmering with tears. "If I don't make it, don't blame yourself. You've done enough. You've sacrificed too much already. You have to keep living. You have to find happiness for yourself. Don't let me become a burden that drags you down for the rest of your life." "No," Alara almost shouted, her whole body trembling. "Don't say that. You're not a burden. You're everything I have. You're the reason I'm still alive today. I'll save you. I swear I'll save you no matter what I have to do." "Sister." Sophie lifted her thin hand to Alara's cheek, wiping away the tears streaming down. "Grandma always said a clean conscience is the most precious thing there is. Don't ever do anything that makes you lose it because of me. I'd rather die than watch you lose yourself." Alara wrapped her arms around her sister and sobbed into the thin hospital gown. She didn't know how she could find $250,000 in 6 months and still keep her conscience clean. She didn't know what miracle could save her sister. But she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Sophie die. No matter what she had to give up, no matter what danger she had to face, she would find a way. "Grandma, please watch over me." Alara prayed silently through her tears. "I can't lose Sophie. I can't lose the last family I have left in this world." At the same moment, Alara was collapsing in tears beside her sister's hospital bed at St. Mary. Maxwell Briggs was standing inside Kieran Thornton's office on the highest floor of Thornton Tower, a thick file clutched in his hands. He had spent 4 days investigating Alara Reyes as the boss had ordered, and what he uncovered was enough to soften even someone as hardened as Max. Alara Reyes, 27 years old. Max began reading the report. Her mother left when she was 6. Her father was an alcoholic who abused her regularly and died in an accident when she was 16. Her grandmother raised both sisters until she passed away 5 years ago. Currently, Alara works 3 jobs at the same time to pay medical bills for her sister Sophie Reyes, 19 years old, suffering from end-stage kidney failure. Kieran sat motionless behind his desk, gray eyes fixed on the file while his mind drifted far away. A sister with kidney failure. The only family left. working herself to exhaustion to save the person she loved. His mother's face rose in his memory with painful clarity. She had been the same. After his father died, she carried the entire family alone, working day and night to raise him. She had sacrificed everything for him, and in the end she died in his arms at the hands of enemies who wanted to destroy the Thornton family. "Is there anything else?" Kieran asked, his voice lower than usual. Max flipped a few more pages. This morning, Sophie Reyes was admitted to the emergency room due to complications. Doctors say she needs a kidney transplant within 6 months, estimated cost around $250,000. Alara Reyes currently has $127 in her account and owes the hospital $8,200 in previous bills. Kieran closed his eyes. $250,000. To him, it was a trivial sum, money that could be made in a single good night at a casino. But to Alara, it was an impossible number, a towering wall, standing between her and her sister's life. And yet she had still left that note admitting fault for a scratch on a car she knew she could never repay. "Monitor the sister's condition," Kieran ordered as he opened his eyes. "Report every development to me, and don't let anyone know." Max nodded, unable to hide the surprise in his expression. In 18 years of following Kieran, this was the first time he had seen the boss care about anyone outside of business. "Boss, may I ask one question?" Max hesitated. "Why does this girl matter to you so much?" Kieran was silent for a long moment, his hand unconsciously touching the inside pocket on the left side of his jacket, where Alara's note still rested. "Because she reminds me that there are still good people in this world," he said softly. "And I forgot that for far too long." At the same time, at the Obsidian nightclub, Agnes Monroe was searching everywhere for Alara. She had heard the poisonous rumors spreading and she knew they couldn't be true. 35 years of observing people had taught her how to distinguish the good from the wicked, and Alara's eyes weren't the eyes of someone calculating. When Agnes couldn't find Alara at the club, she asked around and learned that the girl had taken leave because her sister was hospitalized. She immediately went to St. Mary Hospital and found Alara curled on a plastic chair in the hallway, eyes swollen from crying, face pale from exhaustion and grief. "Child," Agnes sat down beside her, her voice gentle like a warm breeze. "I heard your sister was admitted. Are you all right?" Alara looked up, and when she saw the genuine concern in those warm brown eyes, she couldn't hold back anymore. She told everything, about the fateful rainy night, about the scratch, about the note and the decision to leave her real name despite knowing the consequences could be terrible, about the vicious rumors closing in on her, about Sophie and the $250,000 figure that felt like a death sentence, about the fear of losing her sister, her job, and everything else simply because she chose to do the right thing. Agnes listened without interrupting, her eyes slowly filling with tears as the story unfolded. When Alara finished, Agnes wrapped her arms around the young woman as if holding the daughter she never had. "My foolish and brave child," Agnes whispered, her voice breaking. "You did the right thing. Do you hear me? You did absolutely the right thing. Those who spread those rumors aren't worth your attention." "But the rumors?" Alara sobbed. "I didn't do anything wrong. So why are they treating me like this?" "Because they're afraid," Agnes said gently, stroking her hair. "They're afraid of your honesty because it exposes their own lies. They hate you because you have something they don't, a clean conscience. But remember this, the truth always finds its way into the light, and the people who matter will see who you truly are." Agnes held Alara tightly, and in the warm embrace of a woman who felt both strange and deeply familiar, Alara cried like a child being protected for the first time in her life. 1 week had passed since the day Agnes held Alara and cried with her in the hospital corridor. Sophie was more stable now, but remained hospitalized for monitoring, and Alara was still racing against time, searching for a way to find $250,000 she knew was impossible. She kept working 3 jobs, kept enduring contemptuous looks and poisonous whispers, kept living like a shadow in a world that refused to see her worth. But tonight, everything was about to change. At the Obsidian nightclub, on the highest floor where only the most powerful guests were allowed to set foot, Kieran Thornton sat across from Ivan Petrov, the most powerful Russian Mafia patriarch in Eastern Europe. This was a negotiation Kieran had prepared for over 6 months, a port control partnership deal worth $20 million, enough to reinforce the Thornton empire against the growing threat of Yuri Volkov, his lifelong enemy who was circling, waiting to seize his territory. Ivan Petrov was a 60-year-old man with silver-white hair and eyes as cold as Siberian ice. He didn't trust Americans, didn't trust English, and would only negotiate in his native Russian. That was why Kieran had hired Viktor Sokolov, a professional interpreter of Russian descent, to ensure the talks went smoothly. But tonight, Viktor didn't show up. 10 minutes before the meeting began, Max received word that Viktor had been hospitalized with severe food poisoning, a coincidence too perfect to be accidental. Someone had deliberately sabotaged this negotiation, and Kieran knew exactly who was behind it. Yuri Volkov. Now Kieran sat facing Ivan Petrov and his 3 associates, struggling to communicate in the limited Russian he knew. But the technical terminology of cargo transport, port control, and profit division was far beyond his linguistic reach. Ivan Petrov grew increasingly impatient. He spoke in Russian at a speed Kieran couldn't follow, his face flushed with anger. His associates exchanged loaded glances, and Kieran knew what they were saying, even without understanding the words. They were saying this was disrespect. They were saying Thornton wasn't serious enough for this deal. They were saying they should leave immediately. Ivan Petrov slammed his hand on the table and rose to his feet, his voice thundering through the room. Kieran didn't need to understand Russian to know Petrov had just called this a waste of time. Petrov turned his back, and his 3 associates stood up with him. Kieran felt the ground give way beneath him. 6 months of preparation, $20 million. His only chance to secure his power before Volkov struck. All of it was slipping through his fingers because an interpreter had been poisoned. Max stood beside him, his face tight, his hand already resting on the gun beneath his jacket by instinct. Kieran's lieutenants sat around the table with expressions like mourners at a funeral. Miranda Ashford stood in the corner of the room in her role as a server, and Kieran caught a fleeting, satisfied smile on her lips. She was enjoying his failure. Perhaps she even had a hand in Viktor's poisoning. Kieran knew he had to do something, had to say something to keep Petrov from leaving, but he had no language. He had no way to communicate with the man walking toward the door. He, the most powerful mafia boss on the east coast of the United States, was helpless like a child before a simple language barrier. "Wait," he said in English, knowing Petrov wouldn't understand. "Please give me more time." Petrov didn't turn around. He placed his hand on the door handle, ready to walk out and take Kieran's last chance with him. The $20 million deal was about to collapse completely, and if it collapsed, Volkov would have the strength to unleash the war he had been preparing for so long. Outside the VIP room where the $20 million deal was collapsing, Alara Reyes was kneeling on the hallway floor, mopping as she did every night. Miranda had deliberately assigned her to this shift, to this area, as a subtle form of humiliation, to force the cleaning girl rumored to be trying to seduce the boss to kneel and scrub the floor right outside the room where the boss was meeting the most powerful figures in the city, to make her bow lower, feel smaller, become even more invisible. But Miranda didn't know one thing. Alara could hear everything happening inside, not because she was trying to eavesdrop, but because Ivan Petrov's voice was too loud, too furious, echoing through the thick wooden door, and Alara understood every word he said. Russian. The language she had taught herself over 5 years from old books bought at thrift stores, from free videos online, from countless sleepless nights when Sophie lay asleep and Alara had nothing but the dream of escaping poverty. She learned Russian because she once read that Russian interpreters earned very good money. She learned it with the hope that one day she might use it to change her life. That day had never come until tonight. Eto pustaya trata vremeni. My ukodim. Alara heard Petrov roar. "This is a waste of time. We are leaving." She immediately understood that the negotiation was failing. She also heard Petrov's associates murmuring to one another, saying this American was disrespectful, that having no interpreter was an insult, that the Petrov family had no need to work with people who weren't properly prepared. Alara stopped mopping, her heart pounding violently in her chest. She could help. She knew she could help. But if she stepped into that room, she would be noticed. She would no longer be the safe, invisible shadow in the corner. Those who hated her would have even more reason to attack her. Miranda would find a way to destroy her completely, and if she failed, if her Russian wasn't good enough, she would become a joke in front of everyone. But if she did nothing, the deal would collapse. She didn't know how important it was, but she knew enough about this world to understand that a failed deal could cost many people their jobs, their income, their means of survival. People like her, people who lived paycheck to paycheck. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Kindness isn't about who's watching. It's about who you choose to be in the moment that matters. Alara stood up. Her legs trembled. Her hands were still wet from the mop water. Her cleaning uniform was wrinkled, stained at the hem. She knew how she looked. a poor, small girl who didn't belong in a room full of powerful men. But she still walked to the door and knocked. The sound echoed into the tense silence inside. Ivan Petrov had his hand on the door handle, ready to leave. But the knock made him pause. The door opened, and Alara stepped inside. Every eye turned toward her. Kieran froze when he saw the girl he had been watching for a week. Max's hand moved toward the gun under his jacket by instinct. Kieran's lieutenant stared at her, as if she were an ant that had crawled onto a royal banquet table. Miranda clenched her teeth, hatred blazing in her eyes as she saw Alara dare to appear here. And Ivan Petrov, the powerful Russian Mafia boss, looked at the small girl in a cleaning uniform with confusion and disdain. Alara felt her knees weaken. She felt the confidence she had gathered slipping away under the weight of those stares. But she thought of Sophie lying in the hospital. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the note she had left on the car that rainy night. She had chosen to do the right thing once. She could choose it again. She took a deep breath, met Ivan Petrov's eyes, and spoke in flawless Russian. U was hami gospodin Petrov, pozhaluista, prostite za wmешательство. Меня зовут Alara Reyes. Я могу помочь с переводом, если вы позволите. Dear Mr. Petrov, please forgive the interruption. My name is Alara Reyes. I can assist with interpretation if you allow me. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Ivan Petrov stood there, his hand still on the door handle. Icy blue eyes locked on the small girl who had just spoken Russian with an accent so perfect he almost didn't believe his ears. Kieran looked at Alara as if seeing her for the first time, even though he had studied her file dozens of times. Nothing in that file mentioned she spoke Russian. Nothing explained how a cleaning girl could command such a complex language so flawlessly. And in the corner of the room, Miranda Ashford ground her teeth until her jaw nearly cracked. She had done everything to push Alara into the mud, yet the girl kept rising. She had spread rumors. She had isolated her. She had humiliated her. And now the girl stood in the middle of a room filled with the most powerful men in the city, speaking Russian like a native, with the power to save the $20 million deal that Miranda herself had helped sabotage. Ivan Petrov studied Alara for several long seconds, as if weighing whether she was real or merely an illusion. Then he released the door handle and turned back fully, the icy blue of his eyes flickering with a spark of curiosity. He asked in Russian, his tone still rigid but no longer furious. Who are you? Why does a cleaning worker speak Russian? Alara swallowed and forced her voice to remain steady even as her heart hammered like a war drum. Sir, I taught myself Russian because I admire Russian culture and literature. I know this is an improper interruption, but I couldn't stand by and watch an important negotiation fail because of a language barrier. If you allow it, I would like to serve as an interpreter. Petrov was silent for a moment, then suddenly laughed. His laughter filled the room, startling everyone present. Russian literature, he asked with interest. Who do you read? Dostoevsky, sir. Alara replied without hesitation. Crime and Punishment changed how I see the human conscience, and Tolstoy, with War and Peace, taught me that true strength doesn't lie in power, but in patience and integrity. Petrov's eyes lit up. He looked at Alara with a completely new respect. The respect reserved for someone who understood the soul of his people, rather than just their language. He turned to Kieran and spoke in Russian, which Alara translated immediately. Mr. Thornton, this girl is more interesting than all the men in this room combined. I will stay. Let her interpret. And so the negotiation resumed. Alara stood between the two sides, translating every sentence with flawless precision. But she didn't translate words alone. She translated culture. When Kieran made a proposal she knew could be misunderstood through a Russian lens, she subtly adjusted the phrasing to preserve the meaning while aligning with Petrov's mindset. When Petrov made a demand she recognized as a test of sincerity in the Russian way, she briefly explained the cultural context to Kieran before translating. She became a living bridge, connecting not only two languages but two worlds. 3 hours passed like 30 minutes. Terms were discussed. Numbers were negotiated. Disputes were resolved. And through those 3 hours, Kieran couldn't take his eyes off Alara. He watched her standing there in her wrinkled cleaning uniform, surrounded by $1,000 suits and powerful faces, yet she never diminished. She shone. Her eyes lit up when she spoke. Her hands moved with natural grace. Her voice carried confidence, even though he knew she was trembling inside. This girl, this cleaning worker with $127 in her account, was saving his $20 million deal. And she was doing it not for money, not to impress anyone, but because it was the right thing to do. Just like the note on that rainy night. When the final terms were agreed upon, and the two sides shook hands. Ivan Petrov turned to Alara with a rare smile on his otherwise cold face. He spoke in Russian, looking straight into her eyes. "Эта девушка стоит больше, чем 10 мужчин. Берегите ее. This girl is worth more than 10 men. Protect her well." Alara translated his words for Kieran, her cheeks flushing from the unexpected praise. Kieran looked at her, and for the first time in 21 years, his gray eyes weren't cold as ice. "I know," he said in English, his voice deeper and warmer than usual. "I know her worth." Miranda Ashford left the Obsidian Club the moment the negotiation ended, not bothering to stay until the end of her shift. She drove back to her luxury apartment at a reckless speed, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The image of Kieran looking at Alara with that warm gaze replayed in her mind like an endless nightmare. 4 years. She had waited 4 years to be looked at by Kieran that way. She had sacrificed her youth, abandoned every other opportunity, done everything to stay by his side, and in those 4 years, he had never once looked at her the way he looked at that nameless cleaning girl tonight. "I know her worth." Kieran's words echoed in Miranda's head, each one like a knife plunging into her heart. He had never said anything like that about her. Not once. When she reached home, Miranda didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the darkness, her phone in hand, and scrolled to a number she had saved long ago, but never dared to call. Until now. Yuri Volkov. The sworn enemy of the Thornton family. The Russian Mafia boss whose father had killed Kieran's mother 21 years ago. Miranda knew that if she made this call, she would cross a line she could never return from. She would become a traitor. But she didn't care anymore. If she couldn't have Kieran, then no one was allowed to have him, least of all that miserable Alara Reyes. The call connected after 2 rings. Volkov's voice came through, deep and cold. "Miranda Ashford. I have been waiting for this call for a very long time." She knew Volkov had been watching her, had always known she was a potential weakness in the Thornton Empire, and now, she was ready to become exactly that. "I can give you information from the inside," Miranda said, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "In return, I want you to help me eliminate someone." Volkov gave a low chuckle. "Let me guess. The cleaning girl Thornton has taken an interest in." Miranda froze. "You already know." "I know everything that happens inside Thornton's empire," Volkov replied. "Tell me your plan." And so the deal was struck. Miranda would supply Volkov with internal information, including details of the newly signed deal with Petrov. In return, Volkov would help her frame Alara in a way she couldn't escape, and when the Thornton Empire collapsed, Miranda would claim her rightful place beside the victor. 2 days later, Miranda carried out the first step of the plan. She waited until Alara finished her shift and left the locker room, then slipped inside and shoved a USB drive into the pocket of Alara's coat. The drive was loaded with confidential files about Kieran's business operations, information that would cause devastating damage to the Empire if leaked. Along with it was fabricated evidence showing Alara had been in contact with Volkov for months. The next morning, Miranda reported directly to Frank Callahan, one of the most brutal and hardline lieutenants under Kieran. She didn't go to Kieran because she knew he would investigate thoroughly before acting. Frank was different. Frank hated traitors more than death itself, and he would act immediately. "I found a traitor," Miranda told Frank, her voice heavy with feigned concern. "Alara Reyes, the cleaning worker the boss has been paying attention to. I noticed suspicious behavior and checked her locker. I found confidential documents there." Frank didn't need to hear another word. He gathered his men and stormed into the Obsidian Club in broad daylight while all the staff were working. Alara was wiping down tables in the main area when 5 large men surrounded her. Before she could understand what was happening, 2 of them grabbed her arms and yanked her up roughly. "Alara Reyes." Frank stood in front of her, his voice cold as ice. "You are under arrest for spying for Volkov and stealing confidential Thornton family documents." "What?" Alara panicked, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything. I don't even know who Volkov is. Shut up." Frank roared and slapped her hard across the face. She fell to the floor, blood seeping from the corner of her split lip. All around them, the staff watched in terrified silence. Miranda stood in the corner, her face twisted into a mask of false concern, while her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Take her to the basement," Frank ordered. "I'll handle this my way." Alara was dragged away in front of dozens of people, her cries and desperate pleas echoing through the club, but no one dared to intervene. In this world, being accused of betrayal was the same as a death sentence, and Alara Reyes had just been condemned before she was ever given a chance to defend herself. The basement of the Obsidian Club was a place that terrified even the hardest men. With no windows and no natural light, only flickering yellow bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and a damp stench mixed with something Alara didn't dare identify. She was dragged through the dark corridor, her legs too weak to support her. Her arms wrenched so tightly she knew bruises would bloom for days, if she lived long enough to see them. The interrogation room at the end of the hallway was cramped and suffocating, furnished with a metal table, 2 chairs, and tools hanging on the wall that Alara refused to look at for too long. She was shoved into the icy chair, her hands tied behind her back, while Frank Callahan loomed in front of her like a predator ready to tear its prey apart. Frank was 55, bald, his face carved with scars from past battles, the man who had handled traitors for the Thornton Empire for 20 years, and no one ever left this room intact. He enjoyed his work. He savored it. "So you're the little rat who bit the hand that fed her," Frank sneered, his voice grinding like stones. A cleaning girl who thought she was clever enough to spy for Volkov. "I'm not spying for anyone," Alara said, her voice shaking as she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I don't even know who Volkov is. I didn't take any documents." Frank slammed his fist onto the metal table, the sound crashing through the room like thunder and making Alara flinch. "Don't lie to me," he roared. "The confidential files were in your locker. There's proof you've been in contact with Volkov. You think I'm stupid enough to believe a girl like you?" "I was framed," Alara sobbed, tears streaming down her face and mixing with the blood from her split lip. "Someone put those things there. Please believe me. I didn't do anything wrong." Frank burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the room like a demon's cackle. "Framed. That's what every traitor says before I pull the truth out of them." He leaned forward until his face was inches from hers, his breath thick with cigar smoke. "I'll give you one last chance. Tell me what you gave Volkov, who your accomplices are, and I'll let you die quickly. If you don't, I've got all night, and I promise you'll beg for death before the sun comes up." Alara looked into Frank's eyes and knew he wasn't bluffing. She had heard the stories about this room and what happened to people brought down here. She knew she was facing death, slow and brutal, if she didn't say what he wanted. But she couldn't confess to something she hadn't done. "I'm not a traitor," Alara said, her voice breaking but her gaze never leaving his. "You can do whatever you want to me, but I won't confess to something I didn't do. My grandmother taught me that a clean conscience is the most precious thing there is, and I'd rather die than lose it." Frank stared at her, his eyes narrowing with fury and something close to surprise. In 20 years, no one had ever dared to look him in the eye and refuse him like this. "You're brave," Frank said slowly, "or stupid. Either way, I don't mind. I enjoy breaking the brave ones more than the cowards. It's much more entertaining." He ordered the guards out, shrugged off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and pulled on a leather glove while Alara watched, terror flooding every cell of her body, knowing screaming or begging wouldn't save her. All she could do was close her eyes and pray, thinking of her grandmother and apologizing for not being able to save Sophie. Frank raised his arm, fist clenched, ready to strike. But the blow never came because the steel door burst open with a deafening bang, slamming into the wall hard enough to leave a dent, and Kieran Thornton stood in the doorway, his presence radiating a killing cold that made the air feel solid, his gray eyes locking onto Frank with a look anyone who knew the ghost would recognize instantly as death itself. "Who gave you permission to touch her?" Kieran said, his voice low and icy, each word dropping like a stone, and Frank froze with his fist still raised, unable to lower it or move, knowing with terrifying clarity that if he answered wrong, this room would become his own grave. Kieran stepped into the room with slow but unmistakably threatening strides, and Frank lowered his fist and took a step back, the survival instinct of a man who had lived decades in the underworld warning him this was not the moment to argue. "Boss, the girl is a traitor," Frank tried to explain, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "Confidential documents were found in her locker. There's proof she contacted Volkov. I was just doing my job." "Who ordered you to take her?" Kieran asked, without even looking at Frank as he walked straight to Alara. He took in her face with dried blood at the corner of her mouth, her eyes red from crying, her entire body trembling with fear, and a fury exploded in his chest so violent he had to restrain himself from pulling his gun and shooting Frank on the spot. "Miranda Ashford reported it to me," Frank replied. "She said she found evidence, and I acted immediately to stop the traitor from escaping." Kieran knelt in front of Alara and gently untied the restraints at her wrists, his hands that had killed without hesitation, touching her now with a tenderness he didn't know he was still capable of. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. "I didn't do anything wrong," Alara whispered, tears spilling over again. "I swear I didn't betray anyone. I know, Kieran said, and those two words made Alara look up at him in stunned disbelief. You don't need to swear. I know you didn't do it. He stood and turned to Max at the door. Take her to the safe room. Call a doctor to examine her. No one goes near her without my order. Max nodded and gently helped Alara to her feet, leading her out of the hellish room, and when the door closed, Kieran turned to Frank with eyes cold as ice. You'll wait here until I finish investigating, and if she's innocent, you'll pay for every bruise on her body. Frank swallowed and nodded, not daring to say another word. For the next 3 hours, Kieran sat in the security room with dozens of camera screens before him, rewinding every piece of footage from the past week frame by frame in search of the truth. And he found it. The video showed Miranda sneaking into the locker room right after Alara left, opening her locker and slipping a USB into the pocket of her coat. Her face captured clearly under the lights. Undeniable. But that wasn't all. Kieran ordered the tech team to access Miranda's phone records, and what they found was worse than he had imagined. Dozens of calls to Yuri Volkov over the past 2 months, encrypted messages containing information about Thornton business operations, and a clear agreement. Miranda would provide inside information and frame Alara, and in return Volkov would secure her a place when he took over the empire. Miranda hadn't just framed Alara. She was the real traitor, selling out the Thornton family to the enemy for months. Kieran closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the anger inside him no longer burning hot but turning into something far colder, the kind of rage those who knew him called the wrath of the ghost. Summon all captains and senior staff, he ordered, now. An hour later, the largest conference room at the Obsidian Club was packed. Every captain, manager, and senior employee present, including Miranda Ashford, who stood at the front with smug confidence, certain she had succeeded in eliminating Alara and was about to be praised for exposing a traitor. Kieran stepped forward, his face expressionless, and signaled Max to turn on the large screen behind him. I called everyone here today to deal with a traitor, he said, his voice carrying through the room. Miranda smiled, thinking this was the moment Alara would be condemned, but that smile froze on her lips when the images appeared. Footage of her sneaking into Alara's locker room, planting the USB, followed by audio recordings of her calls with Volkov, echoing through the deadly silence, her voice crystal clear as she sold Thornton's secrets to the enemy. Miranda Ashford, Kieran said, turning to her with eyes cold as hell. You betrayed the family. You framed an innocent woman. You sold information to Volkov. Do you have anything to say? Miranda trembled where she stood, her face white as paper, looking around for support and finding only contempt and hatred. Kieran, I did everything because I love you, she sobbed, collapsing to her knees. I've loved you for 4 years. I couldn't stand seeing you look at that girl. Please spare me. I'll do anything. Kieran looked at her without a shred of mercy. Love doesn't destroy the innocent, he said coldly. What's inside you isn't love. It's toxic obsession and blind jealousy. You nearly killed a young woman out of envy, and you sold this family to the man who murdered my mother. There's no forgiveness for that. He turned to Max. Seize all her assets, expel her from the empire, and hand her over to Ivan Petrov. He needs a gift to strengthen our partnership, Miranda screamed as 2 men dragged her up. No, Kieran, please, don't give me to the Russians. You know what they'll do to me. Kill me instead, please. Kieran turned and walked away without looking back. That was your choice. Now you live with the consequences. Miranda's screams echoed through the club as she was dragged away, but no one felt pity, because in this world, betrayal was an unforgivable sin, and Miranda Ashford had just received the sentence she deserved. After Miranda was dragged away, Kieran turned back to face everyone still standing in the conference room, the silence so heavy it felt possible to hear every single breath. No one dared move or speak, all of them waiting for the next judgment from the man standing before them with eyes cold as ice. Alara Reyes is completely innocent, Kieran said, each word echoing through the room. She was framed by the real traitor, and from this moment on, anyone who dares harm her, even with words or a look, will answer directly to me. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the room to be certain they understood. And I am promoting Alara Reyes to chief interpreter and my personal assistant. She will work directly under me starting tomorrow. A wave of stunned murmurs rippled through the room, everyone shocked that an anonymous cleaning girl had become the closest person to the ghost in a matter of weeks. A position even veteran lieutenants never dared dream of, yet no one objected and no one questioned it. Not after what they had just witnessed happen to Miranda. Frank Callahan stood in the corner, his face pale, knowing he would pay for what he had done to Alara in the interrogation room. And when Kieran glanced at him with a meaningful look, Frank understood their conversation wasn't over. "Dismissed," Kieran ordered. "Everyone return to your duties." When the room finally emptied, Kieran went to the safe room where Elora was being treated, the doctor having cleaned the blood from her lip and confirmed she had only bruises, nothing severe, though no doctor could heal the damage done to her soul. Elora sat on the sofa, staring into nothing, hollow and exhausted, having cried until there were no tears left, and still unable to believe she was alive. When the door opened and Kieran stepped in, she startled to her feet, unsure how to react. "Sit down," Kieran said gently, his voice nothing like the cold authority he had shown before the others. "I need to talk to you." Elora sat, hands clasped tightly in her lap, heart racing as she waited. Kieran pulled a chair close enough for her to see every line of his face but far enough not to frighten her, then reached into his inner pocket, took out a crumpled piece of paper, carefully unfolded it, and placed it on the table between them. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. Elora looked at it and felt her heart stop. The note she had written in the rain nearly 2 weeks earlier, her trembling handwriting still visible despite being blurred by water. "I accidentally scratched your car. I don't have much money, but I'll take full responsibility. I'm sorry, Elora Reyes, night cleaning staff." "That note," she whispered, eyes wide. "You kept it all this time." Kieran nodded. "I found it the night you scratched my car. I stood in the rain and read it dozens of times. And for the first time in 21 years, since my mother died in my arms, something reached my heart." Elora couldn't speak, only stared at him in disbelief. "I looked into you after that night," Kieran continued. "I know about your 3 jobs, your sister, your slum apartment, the $127 in your account. I know how much you're carrying, and I also know that even in that desperate situation, you still left a note, taking responsibility for damage you knew you could never afford to repay." "Why do you care?" Elora asked softly, her voice shaking. "I'm just a cleaning girl. I'm nothing." "Because you remind me of what I lost," Kieran said, meeting her eyes, his gray gaze no longer cold but filled with a deep sadness. "My mother was like you, poor, exhausted, sacrificing everything for me, and she taught me that honesty and kindness are the most precious things in this world. But after she died, I forgot that. I let the darkness swallow me, until I read your note." He pressed a hand over his left chest where the paper had rested for 2 weeks. "You're the first person in 21 years to do something honest in my world without hidden motives. No calculation, no agenda, just simple, vulnerable truth. I kept that note next to my heart to remind myself there are still good people in this world." Elora broke down, tears streaming down her face, never imagining that such a small act in the rain could mean so much to someone like Kieran Thornton. "And there's one more thing," Kieran said. "I know your sister needs a kidney transplant within 6 months, and it will cost $250,000. Elora froze as Sophie's pain crashed over her again. "I'll pay for all of it," Kieran said without hesitation. "Not because you owe me or because I want anything in return, but because for the first time in 21 years, I believe there's someone worth saving, and I want to protect that. Protect you, protect your sister, protect the kindness you reminded me still exists." Elora couldn't speak. She only cried, from relief, from gratitude, and because for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen and protected. Kieran kept his promise, and just 1 week after their conversation in the safe room, Sophie Reyes was transferred to the most prestigious private hospital in the city, where the best doctors in the United States were already waiting to perform the kidney transplant. Kieran had secured a compatible donor through connections Elora didn't dare ask about, and he covered every cost without a moment of hesitation. The surgery lasted 8 hours, and for all 8 hours, Elora sat in the waiting room with her hands clenched together, praying without stopping. She didn't know that Kieran had quietly come to the hospital and stood at the end of the hallway, watching her from a distance, ready to step forward if she needed anything at all. When the doctor finally emerged with a smile and announced the operation had been successful, Elora collapsed to the floor and cried like a child, the first tears of happiness she'd shed after years of suffering. Sophie woke up 2 days later, her eyes opening to the sight of her sister's face beside the bed, smiling through tears. "Sister, I'm alive," Sophie whispered, her voice weak but filled with wonder. "You did it. You saved me." Elora squeezed her sister's hand, unable to speak through the lump in her throat. She wanted to tell Sophie about Kieran, about the note in the rain, about everything that had happened, but she knew some things needed time, And for now, the only thing that mattered was that Sophie was alive and healing. 2 months passed like a beautiful dream Alara was afraid she'd wake up from. Sophie recovered miraculously, color returning to her cheeks, light coming back into her eyes that Alara thought had been lost forever. The sisters moved into a new apartment, clean and safe, in a decent neighborhood, with no mold on the walls, no bedbugs, no more freezing nights curled up in a slum room. And Alara began her new life as Kieran Thornton's chief interpreter and special assistant. The job wasn't easy. Alara had to learn quickly about Kieran's complex business world, the tangled relationships between families, the unspoken rules of the underworld. But she learned fast, worked relentlessly, and gradually became indispensable at Kieran's side in every major negotiation. What surprised Alara most was realizing that Kieran wasn't the monster the outside world imagined. He had principles. He never trafficked drugs despite the massive profits. He never harmed children or innocent women. He secretly funded an orphanage in the poor neighborhood where he'd grown up. He paid his employees generously and took care of their families when hardship struck. Beneath the cold and ruthless exterior, Kieran Thornton had preserved a part of the man his mother had raised, and Alara was the first person in 21 years allowed to see it. Kieran changed too. He began to smile more, even if only faintly when Alara said something naive. He started talking more, not just about work but about life, about books he read, about memories of his mother he'd buried for years. He began seeking Alara out not for business but simply to be near her, to hear her speak, to watch her smile. They discovered they shared more than they'd ever expected, a love for classical architecture and old buildings with stories hidden in every brick, the pain of losing loved ones too early, the loneliness that followed, the necessity of being strong far too young because there was no one else to lean on. One autumn afternoon, golden sunlight spilling through the office windows, Agnes came to Alara carrying a cup of hot tea and sat beside her with a gentle smile. "I want to tell you a story," Agnes said, "about Kieran, about his mother, and about my son." Alara listened in silence as Agnes spoke of Thomas, her son, who'd been killed in a gang hit 18 years earlier. Thomas and Kieran had been childhood friends, growing up together in the same poor neighborhood, and when Thomas died, Kieran was only 18, but hunted down his friend's killers himself. "That was the first time he killed someone," Agnes said, her eyes filling with tears. "And from that moment he was no longer the innocent boy I knew. He became the ghost." "But you've changed him," Agnes said, taking Alara's hand. "For the first time in 21 years I see light in his eyes. He's learning how to feel again, and you're the one teaching him." She paused, then continued. "His mother Elena was the finest woman I ever knew. She taught Kieran never to let darkness swallow him, always to seek the light, and he forgot that lesson for 21 years, but you reminded him. You are the light Elena wanted him to find." Alara cried in Agnes's arms, and Agnes held her like the daughter she'd never had, both women understanding that something beautiful was beginning to grow between Alara and Kieran, something they both deserved after all the suffering they'd endured. But happiness in Kieran Thornton's world never lasted long without darkness lurking close behind, and Yuri Volkov had lost Miranda, his most valuable source of inside information, driving him into a frenzy of rage. His plan to take over the Thornton Empire had collapsed completely after Miranda was exposed, and now he had only one goal left: revenge. Volkov knew Kieran's weakness was no longer money or power. It was a small, fragile woman named Alara Reyes. He had men watch her for weeks, tracking every schedule, every place she went, every moment she was alone, waiting patiently for the perfect chance. That chance came one afternoon when Alara went to visit Sophie at the hospital. Max accompanied her as usual, but as they stepped out of the hospital gate, a truck slammed into them from behind. Max was thrown violently to the pavement, his head striking the curb, losing consciousness instantly. Before Alara could even scream, a rough cloth bag was pulled over her head, and she was dragged into a black van. Everything happened in less than 30 seconds. When Kieran received the call, he was in a meeting with his lieutenants at Thornton Tower. His phone vibrated and a subordinate's trembling voice filled his ear. "Boss, Alara's been kidnapped. Max is badly injured. We think it's Volkov." Kieran rose so fast his chair flew back and crashed into the wall, and everyone in the room stepped away when they saw his face. This was no longer the cold, emotionless ghost they knew. This was a wild animal losing the one thing that mattered most, and the madness burning in his gray eyes was enough to terrify anyone. Kieran smashed the conference table with his bare fist, not caring as blood spilled from split knuckles, and for the first time in 21 years he screamed like a drowning man. Then suddenly, he fell silent, and that silence was more terrifying than the scream. He lifted his head, his eyes frozen like hell itself, and spoke with lethal calm. "Gather everyone we have. Everyone. Tonight, we go to war." Volkov had taken Alara to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, once his father's territory 30 years earlier. He intended to kill her there, on ground his father once ruled, as a declaration that the Volkov family would rise again on the corpse of its enemy. Alara was tied to a chair, her face bruised from blows, yet her eyes still burned with defiance. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She stared straight at Volkov, with a look he never expected to see in someone so small. "You think Thornton will come save you?" Volkov sneered, gripping her chin. "He will come, and when he does, I'll kill him in front of you. Then I'll kill you." "He'll kill you first," Alara replied, her voice steady even as her heart thundered. "And if you kill me, you'll wish you'd never been born." Volkov slapped her so hard the chair tipped sideways, but before he could strike again, gunfire erupted outside the warehouse, followed by explosions, screams, and bodies hitting concrete. Kieran had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. More than 50 men from the Thornton Empire surrounded the warehouse from every direction. A brutal battle exploded into the night, gunfire roaring like fireworks, bodies dropping by the second. Kieran led the charge without a bulletproof vest, without regard for his own safety, with only one goal, finding Alara. He tore through the warehouse like a storm, cutting down every enemy in his path with a savagery that even his own men feared. When he kicked open the door to the room where Volkov held Alara, his eyes met hers. She was alive, wounded but alive. Volkov stood behind her with a gun pressed to her temple. "One more step and I shoot. Thornton!" He roared in panic as he realized his forces were nearly wiped out. Kieran stopped, his gaze never leaving Volkov. "You're the son of the man who murdered my mother," he said slowly. "And you dared touch the most important person in my life. There's no forgiveness for that." In a split second, Kieran drew and fired, the bullet tearing through Volkov's shoulder, forcing him to drop the gun and collapse. Kieran stepped forward, planted his boot on Volkov's chest, and looked down with the eyes of death. "You won't die quickly," he said coldly. "I'm handing you to Petrov. The Russians have their own ways of dealing with traitors." Then he turned to Alara, cut her restraints with the knife from his jacket, and as the ropes fell away, he pulled her into his arms for the first time, holding her so tightly it was as if she might vanish if he let go. "I'm sorry," Kieran whispered into her hair, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry you had to endure this." Alara held him back, tears streaming down her bruised face. "You came," she whispered, and that was all that mattered. "You came." A few weeks after the blood-soaked rescue, when everything had slowly settled back into a fragile calm, Agnes Monroe came to Alara with news the young woman had never expected. She sat beside Alara in the small garden behind the Thornton estate, where the late autumn sun painted every turning leaf in gold, and she took Alara's hand with the tenderness of a mother. "I'm retiring, my dear," Agnes said softly, her voice calm though her eyes shimmered with tears. 35 years is enough. It's time for me to go home, back to the garden where Thomas once played, back to the books my son loved, back to the memories I've postponed for far too long." Alara wrapped her arms around her, tears spilling freely. "You can't leave. I need you here. Without you, I don't know how I could survive everything that's happened." Agnes stroked her hair gently, the same way she once did with Thomas when he was small. "You're stronger than you think, Alara. You always have been. I was only here to remind you of that." She leaned back slightly and looked into Alara's eyes with all the love she had given her over the past months. "I lost Thomas 18 years ago," she said, her voice trembling. "My son was only 27. He had eyes like yours, the eyes of someone who carried too much yet never complained. I stayed in this empire for 20 years because I saw Thomas in every young soul who walked through those doors, afraid and hoping someone would see their worth. You remind me of my son more than anyone. You gave me the daughter I never had. Thank you for that gift, one nothing could ever replace." Alara cried in Agnes's arms, and Agnes held her for a long time, tightly, as if she wanted to pass every ounce of strength and love into the young woman before leaving. "But remember this," Agnes whispered. "Kindness is never wasted. Even when it seems unseen, even when it costs you everything, it always comes back. Maybe not the way you expect, but it always comes back." Kieran appeared at the garden entrance, keeping a respectful distance until the two women finished their embrace. When Agnes saw him, she smiled with the look of someone who had watched a child grow into the person she always believed he could become. "Take good care of her, Kieran," Agnes said. "She's special." "I know, Agnes," Kieran replied, his voice low and sincere. "I know." Agnes walked through the estate gates for the last time, her posture straight and composed as always, though Alara saw her lift a hand to wipe her eyes before the car carried her away. Alara stood there watching until she could see nothing more, feeling as though a piece of her heart had left with the woman who had become her spiritual mother. That evening, Kieran found Alara standing alone in the parking lot of the Obsidian Club, where everything had begun. She was staring at his black Rolls-Royce Phantom, and when he stepped closer, he knew exactly what she was looking at. The scratch was still there. After everything that had happened, he still hadn't fixed it. He never would. "You never repaired it," Alara said quietly without turning around. "Why?" Kieran stood beside her, both of them looking at the long scar on the luxury car as if it were a work of art. "Because some scars are worth keeping," he replied, his voice deep and warm. "They remind us of the moments that changed everything. That changed me into someone better." He turned to her, and for the first time in 21 years, there was no trace of ice left in his gray eyes. "You changed everything for me, Alara. You changed who I am." Alara looked at him, and at last, completely, she understood. A small piece of paper on a rainy night had saved her life and melted the heart that had been frozen for 21 years in the most ruthless mafia boss on the East Coast. Honesty had defeated lies, kindness had defeated cruelty, and love had taken root in the place no one ever expected. Somewhere far away, Agnes Monroe smiled in the car carrying her home. She knew her work was finally done. She had seen Thomas and Alara, seen Elena and Kieran, and witnessed two lonely souls find each other in the darkness. Alara's grandmother's words echoed like an eternal reminder. Kindness is never wasted. It always comes back. And this story stands as the clearest proof of that truth. This is a story about the power of honesty in a world full of lies, about the courage to do what's right when no one is watching, about love that can bloom in the darkest places. The lesson we can carry with us is to always keep our conscience clean, no matter how hard life becomes, no matter if no one sees or acknowledges it, because your kindness and honesty will always find their way back to you, maybe not how you expect, but they will return.